Since the beginning of photography, it hasn't really changed all that much. You still have three primary things: your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture. It's been like that ever since the old school film days, way back 100 years ago with the giant plates and stuff. And it's been like that all the way until now with the brand new fancy digital cameras. In this video, we're using the Nikon D750. It was provided by Mastrop. Mastrop has a really cool new photography community, and I was like, hey, we're getting ready to make some photography tutorials. So they were like, dude, let's work together. So thanks very much for them to them for providing the camera. Go check out their photography community. Now let's learn something.
There's things you know, there's things you don't know, and then there's things you don't know.
So let's get you guys to the I know this category. Now this is going to be a very basic video just covering those three things. We're going to talk to you guys maybe like you're 5 or you don't know anything about photography. So if you're someone who's really nerdy and wants like some science and math and all that sort of thing, wait for one of our future videos where we really get extremely nerdy about very minute details and that sort of thing. Okay, first off, ISO. That's sort of the base platform that we need to start talking about. ISO is essentially a camera's sensitivity to light, or the film sensitivity to light, the sensor's sensitivity to light. That's what it is. It's a measure of that. So usually you set that first, depending upon your situation. Is it a dark room? Are you outdoors in bright light? You set that first, and then you can set your shutter and aperture. So first off, let's go and just take a look at what some pictures look like in sort of a dark outdoor environment at a very low ISO, and then we're going to bump the ISO up without changing any other settings and show you what it looks like. So there it is at about 100 ISO, and you can see we're outdoors, kind of dark, and we're going to keep adding.
Now, for the record, when we took these shots, this was about 6 o'clock at night. All of the light in this environment was artificial.
As you can see here, as we get higher, it also starts to wash out just a slight bit, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But there we go. It's just making everything brighter. No other settings are changing. All right, you guys ready to see just what the different noise levels look like? And this is with the Nikon. This camera is kind of the god camera. It's one of the best cameras on the market for low light photography and videography. It's kind of ridiculous, and I don't expect I don't expect many other cameras to be able to compete as far as the low light performance goes and the nice noise that it produces, even at the higher ISO ratings. But let's go ahead and take a look. Go ahead and zoom in here and look around. Nice smooth grain, or I guess I call it grain because it looks almost like film, but that's noise. And then as you move up, a little bit more, a little bit more noise over here. It's always good to look in the blurry areas to see, because you can see the noise patterns. Moving right on up, 1600. Getting a little noisy, but this is unbelievably usable. Most cameras cannot touch this. Most cameras are going to be really, really grainy.
Now, for the record, this was with a static light. It wasn't the most well lit. We wanted it a little dark so we could accentuate the noise in this area. You can see it pretty. This is getting to a point where I would say this is still acceptable use, but ultimately, when you blow this up to, if you wanted this on a print that was really big, you'd see that, and that would be bad.
Unless you're going for the gritty look,
unless you're going for the gritty, grungy look, yeah.
Now, as far as best practices for ISO go, what you want to do is keep the ISO as low as possible, and then use your shutter and aperture to give you a good exposure. Keeping the ISO low will give you nice, smooth, rich colors and low noise.
Okay, next up, now this is where it gets kind of interesting, because we talk about sensitivity on the ISO, but when you get into your aperture, which is the measurement of how open or closed the iris in the lens is, and it allows more or less light to come through, but it also does a very important thing, is it controls your depth of field. Whether you have a really shallow depth of field, and I'm not even kidding, where there's some lenses where you get a depth of field that's an inch, all the way to an infinity where it's wide open. You can see everything in the foreground and the background, and it's all very clear. Most of your telephones out there that have a camera on it, you will get a very wide depth of field, meaning it's deep. You can see everything in the foreground, and everything in the background is also very in focus. And you can get varying levels of that, because sometimes you want the background to exist but not be so far gone that it's somewhere else.
So let's talk about how to control this, shall we?
Yeah.
Now, your aperture is controlled by an f-stop number. Now, the f-stop numbers, there's a little bit of math right here, and I'm not going to go too crazy with it, but it's a measurement of the distance of the opening of the aperture to the inner edge of the diameter of the lens. So the lower the number, the more open it is. And the more open it is, the more shallow the depth of field. So like an f1.5 or 1.0 or even 0 would be all the way open, but no lenses do that. But like an f1 or an f1.5 would be pretty open. And then as you go to higher numbers, the distance from the edge of the, the diameter of the edge of the lens or the outside of the lens increases. So it goes all the way down to like 20, 22, even the 32 on some very expensive lenses. It just looks like someone just snapped this picture with a point and shoot or whatever. You got these guys over here in the background and he's getting he's getting a rifle out of his pocket. And it's Seattle, no one's doing anything. Just everything's in focus. But check this out. We can lower the f-stop, increase or make the depth of field very shallow. Look at that. Those guys aren't even there anymore. Trust me, that they were there. They're hanging out over here. They're coming up the road. Just a nice smooth, look at that background. It's amazing.
And this is what we're talking about when you say you want to isolate your subject, if that's what you're going for. So in cases like this one here, the subject is isolated, the background is well out of focus, and it's got a nice colorful, it creates a backdrop. There's a backlighting to the subject, got forelighting. Ultimately, when you look at this image, you're going to be looking at the subject. You're not going to be looking at the bright colors in the background unless you're on acid.
So let's go ahead and see what it looks like at a higher f-stop. And there we go, the higher f-stop. First thing I look at over here is like, what is that, a mail truck or something on the side? And
Might
you can
be a
read,
bread truck.
Yeah, you read farmer's market and all this stuff, and you're like, oh, there just happens to be someone standing there. Well, that looks just way more pro. And so that's a lower f-stop, higher f-stop.
Flipping back and forth between these two, man, is messing me up. Because it's like, where is he? What's going on? But in this case here, you see where the person is, you see what's happening, and it changes the dynamic of the image.
Speaking of changing the dynamic, let's look at a different subject. Here we have some tomatoes, right?
This would make a really great shot for an ad for a grocery store.
Now this is like a medium aperture, right? Let's go ahead and make the aperture, let's just open up the f-stop, really low number, like f1.4, and there you go. Now the subject is that one little thing of box of whatever those little tomatoes. Foreground's out of focus, background is beautiful and blurry. All your focus is right there. And this is a very open aperture. Here's just some other examples, just showing like how shallow it is when you're, shooting things that are close. That's how blurry you can make the background at low f-stops. This image is barely usable. Just a tiny bit of that meat is in focus. The rest of it's just a mystery. Happens to be a boar, but you would never know it. Look at that. Do you want to put that in your mouth?
No.
What are you being crabby for? With this camera, we can easily see all the different moving parts and see how the shutter works. So right now we're going to show you guys what a really slow shutter looks like. As you can see there, when you hit the shutter button, it goes by. It's open for a long time. So your film or your sensor is being exposed to light for a long period of time, has a lot of time to soak it up.
So when you kick the shutter up a little bit, you may miss it, so you might find 1 or 2 frames in this, because we're only shooting this at, 24 frames a second? So we shot it just at the right speed where you should just barely glimpse it, and it's gone.
Yeah, it's so fast. So that's a fast shutter speed, which is what you'll probably be using if it's bright and sunny outside. You don't want your image to be overexposed or just blown out. So it's a super fast shutter speed, and it's over. That's it. And that's how the shutter works. Now let's talk about what it does. Now there's Kane hanging out. That's a decently fast shutter speed, fast enough to stop him.
I was shaking my head in for this photo, and we were just trying to show that this was high enough shutter speed that it stopped my face from becoming a giant blur.
So when we slow it down, there we go. His head's moving back and forth. It's not fast enough to stop his motion.
1/400th of a second should generally stop human motion. So if somebody's running, it'll stop them mid-stride, and you'll be able to capture that image. If they're the Flash, you're not going to catch them at all because they can move faster than the speed of light.
Yeah, now this camera I believe goes up to 1/4000th or maybe even 1/8000th of a second.
1/4000.
1/4000th of a second. And that's really what you're going to need. 1/2000th, 1/4000th, somewhere in that range, anywhere between that. That will stop a hummingbird with its ridiculous speed flapping. That'll stop that. That'll stop like a cheetah, a snake strike.
If you wanted
airplane,
to get an airplane,
race car.
If you wanted to capture a race car, water.
Yeah, water droplets and all that sort of thing. Sometimes it's interesting to allow the shutter to stay open for a while when you see water. If you've ever seen one of those shots where the water looks like silk, they've left the shutter open for a long time. And then you produce this really interesting effect where all the motion that's happening while the shutter's open is just turning into a blur. So it looks like silk. That's how they've done that. So if you want to stop like a waterfall, shoot it fast. If you want it to look like a silky, almost misty type thing, you can leave the shutter open for a while. Your hands, they shake a little bit. They move a little bit. That can also create blur. So this is me shooting, just moving my hands around at a very low shutter speed. Just I was like, just moving the camera around a little bit. So as you can see there, those subjects are stationary, but my hand is making the blur. There again, I just like moved the camera way too much while the shutter was open. Again, people see this all the time. Like you go to a birthday party, it's dark inside, you take a bunch of pictures and you get back and they all look like this. Happens all the time. People are just like, why, man, why? Well, it's because your shutter speed was too slow because it was trying to compensate for the lack of light.
Best practice for shutter speed, it really has to do with the combination of the other two elements in this. Your aperture, your ISO, and then it's what are you trying to take a picture of? So if you're trying to take a picture of, like the pomegranates, you need a higher shutter speed, just enough to stop your handshake from causing the motion blur. And then you need your aperture set probably wide open or relatively wide open to allow more light in. And then your ISO is going to be set at a level that allows the least amount of film grain or the least amount of noise.
Digital noise, yeah.
But yet still have a nice clear image.
So all these things really work together, and a lot of it's going to be up to you as far as what sort of image you want to take. And you have a lot of power once you learn these three things. Now, some people are going to be overwhelmed and be like, oh man, I have to figure out every time I do a shot what I want the ISO and the shutter and the aperture. What the hell, man? F-stop, what the hell is that? Almost all modern cameras, they have a dial. The dial has M for manual mode, which is how we shot most of these pictures. Just put it on manual mode. But there's also a few other things that you should be familiar with, namely A and S. Sometimes it's S, sometimes it's TV for time value.
The Canon cameras usually have TV and AV for aperture value and time value. The Nikon here has A and S for aperture and shutter. Aperture value, you set it there, you adjust your ISO to where you want, and then you can set your aperture to wherever you want. So in this case, you want a really shallow depth of field. You set it for 1.4, 2.0, really shallow. You can snap the photo and it automatically calculates what the shutter speed is going to be.
It makes it so easy, it's ridiculous. You don't have to worry about anything. It will correctly expose the picture based upon your criteria. Now, if you set it on S for the Nikon or TV for time value on the Canons, now that's going to do the exact same thing, but for shutter. You say like, hey, my son's playing soccer, or I want to get a picture of this bird flying around, so I'm going to put it on shutter value and set the shutter for something really fast, like 1/400th, 1/500th of a second, really fast shutter. And then the camera will calculate the aperture and everything else. So that's how you can use the shutter. And also it's good if you want to I want to get like a nice blurry fluid motion, or you want to get some blur, you can set the shutter very low and then the camera will figure everything else out. So modern cameras make it really easy. On these old cameras, you just have two settings and you do it all yourself and that's it.
So I hope this information has helped you, will help you in developing your photography skills. Go out there, use your camera. Test some stuff out and never be afraid to just take a photo, especially if you're using digital. Just fill up your memory card with stuff. If it doesn't look good, test it, experiment, change what you're doing.
Yeah, you gotta
try
get there and mess
something
around,
new.
man.